that we didn't take any pictures. So I'm kind of active in social media.
Yes, Thomas, absolutely. So are we. So we are more than happy to, we will be sharing it, of course. But just to check, we're also recording this, right? Tanvi?
Yeah, you can,
Yes,
of
ma'am.
course.
We have just started the recording.
No, we need to take permission from him.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, but you have my permission,
Yeah.
so that's good.
Hi, Matthews. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yes, perfect. Hello.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Hi, good evening for us here. Yes, hi. I think some Matthews maybe is with you on this paper, isn't it, Thomas?
Yeah, so we are 3 authors on the paper. Matthäus is the method brain behind it, and he's kind of his postdoc work is around legacy and tradition. So yeah.
We are good to start, ma'am and Thomas, sir.
Another 2 minutes. I think we'll just wait for a couple of minutes. Huh? Let me just check the message on the group.
Yes, ma'am.
Hallo Kim.
Grüß dich, hallo.
Schön, dass du da bist.
Freue mich auch. Bin gespannt.
Ich auch.
Yeah, we can start, I think.
No, ma'am. Hello, everyone. Myself, Tanvi Shinti, part of the Center for Family Business and Entrepreneurship team at SPJIMR. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to today's session, the 11th edition of our research presentation series. SPJIMR, established in 1981 in Mumbai, is top-ranked management institute. It is recognized as India's #1 business school by the Financial Times Global Rankings, ranked among top 5 by Business Today, and rated as level 5 pioneering school by the Positive Impact Rating for its societal impact and sustainability achievements. The Center for Family Business and Entrepreneurship empowers leaders with skills, networks, and global perspectives needed for sustainable growth while upholding the strong family values. As part of its commitment to advancing the research, CFBE has been proudly hosting the Family Business and Entrepreneurship's research presentation series, which fosters insightful discussions with an evolving landscape on family enterprises and entrepreneurship. In this session, we are honored to welcome Dr. Thomas Claus. Dr. Thomas Claus is full-time professor and a holder of the Witten Institute of Family Business Foundation Chair in Corporate Entrepreneurship and Digitalisation in Family Businesses, where he also serves as Vice Dean for Research at the Faculty of Management, Economics and Society. He is additionally an adjunct professor of Business Model Innovation at the University of Southern Denmark. His research focuses on business model innovation, digital transformation, and inter-organizational innovations, particularly in German SMEs and family-owned businesses. He is co-editor of the International Journal of the Entrepreneurial Behavior and Research, a board member at the STEP Project Global Consortium, and has published in leading journals, including Strategic Management Journal, Journal of Management Studies, Journal of Product Innovation Management, and Long Range Planning. Today's topic for the presentation is Tradition Types in Family Businesses, a large-scale classification. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Claus to our 11th edition of our research presentation series. We also look forward to everyone's participation in this engaging and insightful discussion. What are you, Dr. Thomas?
Hello. Thank you for the kind invitation and introduction. That was quite comprehensive, so not much for me to say left for me to say about my person. It's really my pleasure being here today. And
Can we just let in Varun, sir?
No, ma'am already admitted.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, it's nice to see like so many people here. I don't see many faces actually because most of you did not turn the videos on. But I guess you're somewhere hidden behind the black screens. So that's at least my assumption for now. Yeah, my topic for today is I will talk about tradition, and the idea behind the project is to classify tradition into different tradition types, or maybe to be a bit more precise, into tradition narratives. And we did this with a kind of complex methodological approach based on website data, and we have used machine learning, topic modeling, some like qualitative work. So it's methodologically complex, but in the end, it's a kind of a very large scale analysis. If you have questions, in the meanwhile, yeah, I have a presentation. I think I can talk for 45 minutes easily. But if you have questions, you can raise your hand. Yeah, we don't need to save all the questions until the end. So maybe it's less boring and more interactive if you just jump in whenever you want to know something.
Sure.
Okay, the project is something we do together with my postdoc Matthias. He's also here right now, and Jörn Block from Trier University, also in Germany. He's not here today. Yeah. So this does not yet work. Why? Okay, now I will guide you like through the idea why are we looking into this topic? What's the basic idea behind that? Then I would give you some conceptual insights into what are we talking about and what's the theory behind our conceptualization. Then combined view into methods and results. And in the end, a very short discussion actually, because maybe one thing I need to say, it's not a published paper. It is not the final work. The manuscript is still in progress. I think we have now for this year's conferences, we have submitted work in progress papers. That's basically the status where we are. So tradition. We started this project with an interesting observation.
Just a question, just a point. We cannot see your presentation.
Oh, that's...
Yeah, we can. I thought you were just speaking, Thomas.
Oh,
But
actually, I thought I would already share it, so that was my fault then, because I shared it previously, so maybe it's, for whatever reason it stopped. Can you see it?
Yes.
Now
Yes,
again?
Yes, Thomas, we can.
Okay. So tradition. If we talk about tradition, or if we just observe tradition in a more pragmatic family business context, we realize that this word is used quite often. Yeah, so we hear it frequently. Everyone talks about tradition, and even more, we hear tradition is something speaking against innovation. Even in Witten, we host a large family business practitioner conference. Yeah, the topic tradition versus innovation, yeah, was used multiple times. Yeah, so it's kind of common sense, or seems to be common sense, that tradition is something that exists in family firms, but it's bad for change or bad for renewing the company. If we look into previous research, you find evidence for both perspectives, or for two perspectives. One is tradition actually, like on the left-hand side here, hinders innovations. Yeah, you have you rely on your past, on past technologies. There's this idea what would the founder of the company have said if we change things? Yeah, we have always done it this way. Past dependencies, and so on. And on the other hand, and this was something that was also a driver for this project, there was a paper by Alfredo and others saying there is something like a tradition, innovation-driven tradition, tradition-driven innovation. So companies where innovation and change is part of the tradition, is embedded in the DNA of the firm. So, and that was something we were curious about to learn more. Yeah, who's right, who's wrong, or are there maybe more facets about this concept of tradition? Okay, so, and behind this, this perspective, who's right or who's wrong, we can basically differentiate tradition into two perspectives. So on the one hand, tradition consists of some stable, immutable parts, objective elements that are somehow documented in the past of the family business. Yeah, so what is basically in the archives, what is in the stories told about, I don't know, the founder, the great inventions of the past, or whatever. And so, and this is basically the driver for the left-hand side, saying, yeah, okay, tradition is something which is objective, which is somehow carved in stone and can hardly be changed, or at least not changed on a short-term basis. However, in the traditional literature, if you go more like into history or so in other fields, you realize there is also a more dynamic interpretative part. Yeah, so it's not just the objective elements, but there is something that can be interpreted. And thereby, if you look at this, tradition is something that can be interpreted in different ways and has also more flexible elements. So with this tension, we basically started the research project and asked, okay, what are the types of tradition narratives that exist in family businesses? Yeah, it cannot just be the one that it's innovation driven versus it's like risk prevention and consisting to the past.
Conservation.
Mhm.
Versus the conservation, I suppose.
Exactly. So that was the starting point. So if we look into the literature, this Schiltz is not a family business scholar. It's a guy from history who defined tradition as it's a pattern of beliefs, customs, and symbolic practices that are transmitted from one generation to another. And I mean, that also shows that it's not just these objective things. Yeah, it's basically what the stories to be told. And so thereby, as already said, we have on the left-hand side the objective part of the tradition, on the right-hand side we have the subjective part of the tradition. And whereas the objective part is really the what is basically the basis, and these things exist, yeah, they are related to the stories that are told, but the how is then the subjective interpretation. And most of the previous research actually focused more on the left-hand side, yeah, this objective things that are documented, and less on the questions, how can it be interpreted? What are the narratives that are created out of these objective elements? Yeah, so from a theoretical perspective, and we'll talk a bit more about this, the left-hand side would focus more like on imprinting, path dependency, whereas on the right-hand side, you could go into rhetoric, history, and narratives. And that's basically the perspective we are taking here. Yeah. This also, we'll talk about this at the very end, yeah, but from a managerial perspective, if you focus on the objective things, you need somehow to take things for granted. Yeah, so you cannot do much. It's an integral part of daily activities, but it's more defining the boundaries. If I consider more the subjective part, it's a core of, or it can be a core of managerial actions, because I can use rhetorics of traditions to, I don't know, tell a story, to make sense out of things and so on. And there are two analogies I like to use to explain what this means, how objective and subjective parts of tradition are related. One is the so-called Theseus paradox. It's actually something that is a story from ancient Greek history. And so the story behind this was that this ship here was used by Theseus to save a group of children, and so it was a big event. And he sailed back with the children. He rescued, basically. So he was a big hero, and as a status or as a symbol of this success, the Greek wanted to keep this boat. So, but it was of course made out of wood, and it was somewhere, I don't know, next to the shoreline. I don't know if it was in the water or on the land, but whatever. Over the years, those wooden pieces just rotted, and they had to exchange parts again and again and again. Yeah, so some I don't know, planks here and there, and then another wooden rod. And so in the end, what happened is that they had to exchange all the parts of the ship, maybe even multiple times over time, but the symbol was still the same. Yeah, so it was still for them the same ship representing the success in rescuing these children. So what does it mean for the relationship between objective and subjective history or tradition, whereas the objective parts were changed completely? The subjective interpretation was still the same. We could see similar things in family businesses. Yeah. So for instance, I don't know, we work with a firm, they have, they produce winches, and they started with wooden stuff. Yeah. So the first invention, more than 100 years back, was made out of wood, was very simple. And then they changed the materials and they changed the technologies. Yeah, so they used hydraulics, pneumatics. They had lots of different inventions to make the system more complex. Of course, the firm grew, the people changed, the business, the buildings were different. So basically, it's like in this story of the Theseus paradox. The company has changed 100%. But still, if you talk to them, they rely still a lot on this vision of the initial inventor who came up with the first product and who defined what they stand for. There could also be an alternative perspective, like in the silent post phenomenon. So we know this, yeah, if you have multiple people talking to each other. Tulsi, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted you to maybe throw light on the difference between tradition and legacy as you see it.
I would say it's closely related, and there's also some overlap. So tradition is basically then you have objective elements in the past, and you interpret them into the future. And legacy is, of course, the forward-looking part of it. Yeah. So what of these elements I would like to preserve on a long-term basis and hand over to later generations? And I think, especially when it comes to the interpretation, then there is this substantial overlap of legacy and tradition. If we look into our own research on legacy, I would say those people who define the legacy, so the holders of the legacy, the previous generations, they have very clear views about what parts of their legacy they would like to hand over to later generations and what should be preserved over time. And maybe tradition is a bit more holistic in this view. So it's something that's really in the minds of all the people in the end. And legacy could be something that is more intentionally handed over to the next generation.
Okay, thanks.
So the other example here, if you think about the silent post effect, yeah, you tell something to a person next to you, and this person tells it to another person, to another person, to another person. What naturally happens, because there's some slight interpretation and in changing in the way it is described to the next person, very likely the initial thing that you told to someone is different from the very outcome that is told to the last person. So still, the thing that you had at the very beginning has not changed, but the interpretation at the very end is very different. And there's also something we could see in family businesses, yeah, where maybe the firm as such, the product range, their logic and purpose have not changed, still because of the stories that were told again and again over generations with new views and perspectives. The view of the firm could be a very different one at the very end. So it's not, why am I telling you this? It's not necessarily, or not necessary that the objective and the subjective parts are always the same. They can differ quite substantially. If we look into theory, there is something called a narrative theory. And basically narrative theory has the idea that in organizations, interpretations are shaped through stories, through narratives in the end. Yeah, so for instance, if we take an example from strategy, which we all know, yeah, often the described strategy and the emergent strategy, which is then the outcome in the end, are somehow different. And it's because people interpret things differently. And then if you want people to commit or buy into the strategy and then execute it well, it's necessary to support the strategy documents with stories, with narratives in the end. So to ensure that the stakeholders understand it, interpret it, and engage with it. So basically what this does is it links the past with future. Yeah? So instead of just saying, okay, that's our new course of action, most likely what you will do is you provide reasons why this new course of action is aligned with what you have done before, why it is something that that suits the logic or the purpose of the firm. We have something like this, we observed something like this in a very different project where we looked into the implementation of AI in family businesses. And what we realized is often, initially, they thought, oh, that's not something that fits to us, yeah, because we have a different logic here, yeah, and we rely on people and not on algorithms. And then what we saw is those firms where the executives who wanted to implement AI were successful were the ones that somehow showed that it's not speaking against the tradition of the firm, but somehow supports it, or is in line with it, that there have been technological inventions or integrations in the past that were very similar, and that this is not a break with the tradition, but just a continuation. And that's something that is very important to successfully implement strategies or any kind of change in an organization. This narrative theory has basically three elements. Yeah, one is there's always a sequence in time. Yeah, so there's something in the past which is interpreted and then transformed into the future. There are actors, and these actors have basically two roles. One is the kind of sender who wants to tell a story, and then there is a receiver who interprets this like story in a particular way and contrasts it also with their own values and belief systems. And then there is kind of a narrative voice, meaning the sender will use his or her individual point of view to interpret those objective elements. And the process of, if you then put this into something that you find in the literature, rhetoric history, if you want to use these narratives, it's basically a strategic use of the past as a persuasive strategy to manage key stakeholders in the firm. So going back to our tradition thing, you have objective elements that are there, but these can be interpreted very differently. Yeah, and you can tell different stories depending on what outcome you would like to achieve. Yeah, the past is good and necessary, especially to create credibility. Yeah, because if you just say, "Oh, I believe in something, I want to make the change because that's my personal opinion," people may say, "Ah, is this credible opinion? I'm not sure." But if you say there were stories in the past, there were events where this company has already did this and that, you give it, as I said, you give it the credibility because you link personal opinions or this narrative voice with something people take for granted or accept as a basis of the firm. And then you say, okay, we interpret it in a certain way. We say, of course, we subjectively select those things that help us telling the story, and we may neglect those elements that are not in favor of our story, but this is just part of the interpretation. Yeah, that's why it is subjective. And then in this plot, we project some kind of like future that relates to the past in a way we would like to shape it. In the literature here, they talk about the tropes. Actually, I had to look up the word tropes myself. It's basically something like reference points that help interpretation. Yeah, it's rhetoric elements that help us to interpret a story. And then this can create something. And these are just examples. Yeah, it could reduce the risks, risk assumption if we do something. Yeah, like in my AI case. Yeah, you could perceive AI as a very uncommon, not understandable, complex technology, Terminator technology. Yeah, and then you may be very afraid, or you may realize, oh, we are used to dealing with substantial technological change over time because we did multiple times. So that's something that's just in our DNA. It's just another change coming up in line with our long-term history. And it mobilizes the people, hopefully. Yeah. And in the end, what you can achieve, it's commitment. Yeah. Or you could also say alignment. Yeah, because the change is not a break with tradition, but it's maybe just a logical continuation of what you did in the past. And if you're thinking about this, it's helpful whenever you are interested in transformation and change in organizations, because we often, coming back to my initial point, assume change is against tradition. Yeah, but if we think about this narrative perspective, change can be a consequence of tradition because you strategically use it in an interpretative way. I give you one example from the literature in this, which was mentioned. Actually, they did not develop it, but it was mentioned in this AMR paper here by Herdecke and others, and I think nicely showed how these narratives can be used. There, in 2010, there was an acquisition of Kraft Foods Canterbury was there was an acquisition of Canterbury by Kraft Foods, and it was initially considered to be a failure because these companies were long-term competitors. They were very different, and like with other prominent M&A activities such as Daimler Chrysler or so, many people thought like that this will never turn out to be successful. But what they did in like telling the story about this acquisition is they used what they call nostalgia here. They relied on narratives surrounding this ideal or this story about growing together. Instead of telling a story of competition, which was really fierce over time, they were more focusing on like joint growth, similar products, yeah, successes in both companies, and relied on the initial founders' faith and passion and focus on quality, their values, which were really similar. Yeah, so they did neglect more the competitive elements and did not tell the stories about where these companies were fighting, but they particularly highlighted those alignment factors. And in the result, they were able to mobilize people because they suddenly believed in the complementarities of these firms. I think I don't need to go too detailed in the results of this paper. What they basically show here, it's an interesting read, and I think it's better to read the full story instead of me telling you everything behind it, is depending on the perspectives of a receiver. So whether the receiver is more past or future oriented, the emotional profile of a receiver, and their like preconditioned perceptions, it may be helpful to rely on different types of narratives. Yeah, so just as an example, first line, if we go through it here, if you have a traditional patriarchic family business owner who would be more oriented towards the past, relying heavily on social emotional wealth, being sentimental about the past and their own achievements, maybe leading more to more risk-averse behavior, preserving the company for future generations. It may be better to argue with nostalgia instead of just some like dystopia or like very future-oriented visions. So it's more than, okay, using their rhetorical views to help them to think about potential futures. Yeah, it's not saying, oh, we stay where we are, but the way to justify change is more linking it to this belief system of the people who are in this particular narrative. Okay, so this is basically the background where we are. To give you an idea, okay, what is tradition all about? What is our view on narratives? So now we said, okay, how could we capture tradition of firms? And it's like with other very subjective constructs such as culture, so it's difficult to grasp, especially with this narrative perspective, because not the full story can be told, but just looking into archives or the story that people tell. So we used a different approach now. We identified first the process of typical developing a taxonomy. And I will explain the particular steps in the next slide. So we had data, we kind of pre-processed the data. The data came from websites. I'll give you more details about this. And then we used a kind of new developed combination of qualitative analysis and machine learning to come up with these typology or tradition narratives going into our topology. And then in the end, in order to prove whether this typology makes sense and has some predictive relevance, we combined the results of the typology with some objective firm level data we had from our initial database. So how did this go? From another project, we identified a set of more than 10,000 family businesses in the DACH region. DACH stands for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. They are all from a limited set of NACE codes, all manufacturing firms, and they have a rather small firm size. They are not the very large ones are not included, and they have also a certain firm age. I think all beyond 15 years. So to exclude the startups who may not have tradition yet. Yeah. we identified the websites of these firms, and then came up with a list of links to each of these websites. You can see there is a slight drop because not all of the firms had websites, or some were they had multiple firms, but just one website referring to all of them. Then we used the web scraping approach with a Python algorithm to get all the text data describing the firm's tradition narratives. Yeah, the assumption behind this, I mean, that's an assumption, that's also a limitation, of course, is the way firms describe themselves and their traditions towards the outside is kind of an interpretation of their tradition. Yeah, of course, we cannot capture the objective things. Yeah, that would be then the way if you go into the archives. So that's also why we talk about tradition narratives here. Through this algorithm, we got in total text documents from 30-something thousand websites. Most companies had multiple websites talking about tradition. And from then 9,000 something companies left. And when just using those texts that explicitly mentioned the term tradition, we came down to 4,000 something companies, but still substantial. Yeah, you could say it's a limitation that we only focused on tradition, but that was the best way to identify texts that were particularly referring to tradition. So then we started the classification, and that's a bit also a story of trial and error, to be honest. First step, I don't want to go into the details. If you want to know more about the specifics of the method, Matthias is really the expert on it. But as usual, if you work with text data, you need to ensure in the very beginning that you have exclude stop words, that you get down to the lemmas of the words, yeah, integrate synonyms and stuff. And since we had English and German data, we had to use two different tools in Python, because one is more specific for the English version and the other is more better working with German data. Then we pre-processed those texts. I think I can basically skip the steps 3 to 4. That's just typical text processing approaches. What we then did is a topic modeling algorithm. It's basically an unsupervised machine learning algorithm that identifies reoccurring topics through semantics, through words that appear together, based on the machine learning analysis. And based on this, our first classification step led to, in total, 3,486 narratives. I will show you more specifically what this means, from 1,800 firms, and reduced it to, in total, 30 topics. So we could say the first clustering was 30 different groups, somehow categorizing tradition narratives. The problem about this, what we realized, is when we looked at it in the very first place, we thought, oh, that's cool. That's really interesting. And I mentioned it to Tulsi earlier. I presented an earlier version last year at a conference, and there I used the 30, or an extract of the 30. But what we realized is, and that's a bit the problem still about using algorithms, the classification was not always based on tradition. It always included tradition, but some classifications, for instance, surrounded particular technologies. Yeah, we had companies from the sheet metal industry, so we had a cluster which was focusing more on sheet metal processing. That was not what we were interested in. And this led to a situation where some of these clusters were not really easily distinguishable, the interpretation was difficult, and there was always some substantial overlap. So that was the initial step. We already saw interesting stuff. Yeah, we saw, for instance, that here in topic 0, responsibility towards the environment was an important aspect. We had clusters that focus more on the external reputation. Tradition and innovation appeared also in 2 of these clusters. So I think they made some initial sense, but they were not finished. Then we said, okay, maybe we cannot fully rely on algorithms. Yeah, so maybe we need to get back a bit to the content analysis and also to do some things manually. So what we did is we used the identified 3,000 something tradition narratives, which you can see here on the left-hand side. It's just a table. Each color represents one of these extracted tradition narratives. And basically it's text fragments which were identified referring to one tradition narrative. And okay, we could not do this for the whole 3,500. So we said maybe what we do is we prepare manually something for then a supervised machine learning in another step. So what we did is we took a random sample of 250 of those tradition narratives, by chance representing 140 firms, and went through these in a typical like Joya content interpretation approach. Yeah, like starting with open coding, identifying first order constructs, then second order themes, and in the end we had higher order constructs that we could align with these narratives.
This was completely random.
Sorry?
This was completely random, the 250 selected narratives.
Yes, yes. We thought about different approaches, but we thought maybe with a random sampling, it's just the most defensible approach. So what we see here is in the first step, we did not identify the typology, but what we identified is the typical dimensions of tradition. And what we see here in the first block is what we call legitimation logic. We see that some of these tradition narratives are used more internally focused to, I mean, we need to keep in mind, these are all put on the website. So of course, the receivers are more external stakeholders, but the reference points are internal focused or folky. Yeah. So for instance, they talk in this internal focus about internal resources, characteristics, describing the internal aspects, whereas in this external focus narrative, it's more about what they do towards the outside. And then we have a rhetorical bridging mechanism. That's the second block, where we basically identify how to say, more objective reference points used for creating the tradition narrative. So in the first, it's objective past. So what are the elements in the past, such as especially competencies that can be used to tell the story. Embedded adaptivity, which would be the second block, where tradition is described as a capacity to change. And the last, which we call moral stewardship, is more tradition as a responsibility. Sorry, I went in the wrong direction. We used the classification from our manual coding then to train an algorithm for supervised machine learning approach, and which is called contrastive learning. And basically, for those who are not familiar with machine learning, then now you tell the algorithm, okay, if this configuration of a narrative of text exists, it should be put into this category. And if you look here on the right-hand side, in the previous approach that we used, the algorithm would basically search for similarities based on like single elements. Yeah, so you have like so-called n-grams, words reoccurring, and then the algorithm would check whether these appear simultaneously. And it would maybe lead to a situation where you say, okay, a sentence like I love coffee and I love tea would be categorized very similarly because they build on the same structure, although the meaning is very different. If you use this other approach, you would first say, okay, this is I love coffee, this is I love tea, and then the algorithm would reproduce the structures behind whether it's categorized in tea or coffee. And yeah, that's just repeated. I think we can keep this very pragmatic for now. The details about the algorithms can be found also in the literature. So yeah, maybe as a way to understand it a bit better, you create kind of vectors between words that are pre-created. So for instance, if you say, okay, man and women have a certain distance, king and queen have a certain distance, the algorithm can reproduce relationships. So for instance, like saying, or king, say king minus man plus woman would mean queen. And or if you say these are the distances between cities and or not cities, countries and cities are related, you could say Rome minus Italy plus Germany would be Berlin. And this the strange of this is then that suddenly words or engrams or so of like fragments of sentences could be interpreted in a better semantic way. Yeah, that's, for instance, saying, okay, the word park and park has a different meaning whether you say go to the center and park the car versus go to the city park to walk. And so that's basically what you do with this. Basically, what you create is a very large vector space, that explains relationships between words or partial sentences. I'm not the expert for the algorithm behind. I just want to give you an idea how it technically works. So, and what we got is a kind of good classification based on our 3,000 something data now. So we used the 250 for manual coding and then scale it up again for the whole data set. And just believe me, all those fit criteria look quite good without interpreting them now in detail. That's the result. And that's, I think, kind of an interesting result. What we achieved is, we achieved in total 6 different tradition narratives that can be put or aligned with these 2 axes that I already explained to you. So let's go through it step by step. The first one is, maybe the names can be made more academic, more fancy, so I try to keep it simple for now. Yeah, the first we called reliability narrative. It's externally focused and it relies much on the objective tradition or objective past. So it's primarily relying on the competency, saying, okay, we are a reliable partner, our tradition, because we have always done it with a high quality, with a high professionalization. So we are your reliable partner in the future, also in the future. And then there is something similar, also objective past, but internally focused. It's more the technical self-conception. It's not so much this like promise towards the outsiders, but the question, okay, where does it come from internally? And we call it technical self-conception, meaning it relies specifically on the products, the technologies, the inventions the firm stands for. So telling those stories about the founder, which I already mentioned before, would be part of this technical self-conception. So we have always been the experts for winches. And then I think these are very much in line, because it's also this objective past, with things we would have expected before. So it's just splitting it up into internal and out, or external. Then the second group of tradition narratives is the embedded adaptivity. And we see the first is what we call driver of innovation. That's very close to what Alfredo has found with this innovation tradition, innovation driven by tradition. So that continued change is part of tradition. Yeah, so telling stories about mastering changes frequently. Yeah, we were always able to deal with crisis, and so change is part of our DNA. The difference between these two here is that in this center, or this cluster that focuses more internally, it's not so much about what the firm is able to do, but more about this transgenerational entrepreneurial spirit of the family behind. Yeah, so it's much more focused. That's the reason why we call it family centered. Yeah, we are a family of like continued entrepreneurs, and we can hand this entrepreneurial spirit over from generation to generation. The last two are, I think, a bit more specific. You could say, well, maybe that's not like the perfect discrimination, but that's just what we found. It's what we call moral stewardship and external. We see that there is a clear tradition cluster describing the responsibility towards external environment, with lots of focus on sustainability, of course, but it's a bit broader. I think it's very much in line with corporate social responsibility as we would interpret it. And the last one is then internally focused, more about, okay, tradition as part of we call it as part of the extended family. Yeah, so it's the responsibility for the stakeholders, but it's also considering the organization as a group of shared, I don't know, tradition holders. Okay, that's basically our result. That's the 6 tradition narratives we found so far. And what we now did, last step, is we said, okay, this could be just like an artifact of our analysis. Yeah, so does it have a meaning? And a meaning would be, I would say, would be found if these clusters discriminate between some external variables that have nothing to do with the tradition narratives. And so that's basically what we then did. We used the sample, and as we had a previous sample with lots of different data about ownership, family involvement, industry, and so on, we said let's combine these data now. And so we combined the typology data with the data we got from the Orbis database, and aggregate this at a firm level. Maybe one thing which is important to mention: some firms have more than one dominant tradition narrative because they had multiple websites, so they could have more than one narrative in place. And for those that had more than one, we didn't say they belong to cluster 1 or 2, like in an absolute way, but we said, okay, in a proportionate way, they have like 33% cluster tradition narrative 1, 33, 2, 33, 4 or so. We had key predictors about family ownership, family involvement, firm age, firm size. There may be more in the future, but that's what we worked with for these initial tests. We ran a set of ANOVAs or MANOVAs, and we were suggested to run an additional profile analysis, which kind of supports the MANOVA results. So what did we see? We saw that basically overall, most of the variables we used somehow discriminate between the tradition narratives. Yeah, so we see that actually there is like also kind of predictive validity of the tradition narratives for other types of variables. So what did we see? For instance, firm age differentiates between the two first tradition clusters, whereas in younger firms, they rely more on their technical competencies as an objective driver of their tradition narrative. The older they get, the more they center on the family aspects, such as what I said, it's more like the transgenerational entrepreneurship. So of course, it's very plausible, yeah, that the reliance on family values or the strength of the family, especially with later generations, improves or increases. Yeah. Then what we see is that, of course, family-centered continuous change is the most important, with a high degree of family involvement in management. The more the identification with a firm is, because the family members are still involved, the higher they center on this aspect that the family drives change and the future course of action of the family firm. Family ownership reduces this technical self-conception. I think that's basically the very similar effect, although we don't see a significant effect here. And the larger the firm, the lower the technical self-conception, the lower also the reliance on this family-centered continued change, but the higher the reliance or the tradition narrative on this driver of innovation. So it's more, okay, it shifts from the family narrative towards the firm narrative when it is about change, and this responsibility towards the employees is also significantly higher in this group.
Is that significant, but it's not significant, right?
The bold ones are the significant ones.
Oh.
With the dot behind it, it's only 10% level significance.
Oh.
Yeah. But we highlighted all the significant ones.
Okay.
Yeah, we then ran those follow-up tests. I think I could just very briefly show you some results. It's very, very similar to what we already saw. This profile analysis. What does it mean? It's not just looking into the individual predictors, but it asks question: do the tradition narratives change, or no, do these predictors such as size or family ownership change the profile of the tradition narratives as a whole? And what we can see here for smaller firms, it is more related to these two first aspects of tradition narratives, whereas the larger the firm gets, it shifts more towards these, I would say, more responsibility related elements of the firm. And the difference between ownership, higher degree of ownership, shifts the focus more from a technical self-conception to this family continued change. But we saw this already, or yeah, more or less in the maneuver. So I'm coming to the end, and what did we find? I would say I told you a lot about narrative theory and rhetorical history at the very beginning, and I'm honest. Yeah, I think we are not fully closing this loop yet. Yeah, so it's the idea, of course, to help researchers better to understand how these narratives can be used in communicating and facilitating change. But it's just, of course, just a first step. But what we do is we shift away from this very objective view of tradition towards a more subjective, interpretative, or narrative-based view. We provide a new typology of 6 different tradition types that can be helpful, could stimulate future research, and maybe we can provide some insights into explaining and managing this typical paradox between tradition and innovation. And I would say methodologically, there may be a methodological contribution here, because this, of course, it's also a limitation, but relying on website data, 30,000 websites, to kind of explore this self-conception of family businesses, maybe a new approach, not just for using or for better understanding of tradition. And practically, I would say, very high level, tradition such as legacy, because we found it about legacy in a different study, are things that should not be just taken for granted, but they can actively be managed by managers, by next generation members, to tell the right story and to facilitate change. Yes, you should not just focus on identifying where you are, but you could also, with interpretation and intentional development of narratives, use these to direct the family firm into a future. And this may be very significant factor of also explaining family firm heterogeneity when it comes to digitalization, transformation, any kind of disruption, and so on. So yeah, that was basically my whole story for today. Thank you so much for being here and listening to me. And we have some time left for questions and an open discussion.
Thomas, it's mind-boggling, the methodology. In fact, I mean, I think just blew me up. But let's open it to the others for questions. I have a question. I'll come back to you. We also have our Dean, Varun, here with us. So Varun, any questions from your side?
Thomas, thank you.
You have to Varun, I think your phone and your laptop both are connected. Maybe you just want to shut one off.
Yeah, rather than
You want to put it on the chat, I'll read it out for you.
Thomas, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Anyone else? So Thomas, I think if there is no one, I'll just ask you a question, okay? And this comes from a certain thing which kind of perplexes me. You have looked at the websites of all the firms in the, what do you call that? The dark area, yeah? Yeah. So there are some of these firms which today are kind of acquiring brands, acquiring companies, and they are kind of the holding companies which have multiple brands under them, which basically means that, you know, any company which has been acquired loses its, and many of the companies which are being acquired, of course, are the ones which are family business companies, right? So I'll give you an example. Forever 21, for instance, which was acquired by a group, which now is under Authentic Brands. Similarly, Authentic Brands holds a large number of these brands. So, you know, when we are doing this kind of quantitative work, my question to you is, how do we look at firms which no longer are under the parent or the original founders or the original owners? And how are we looking at? So maybe you're taking care of that through the ownership, is it? The family ownership?
Yeah, I think we take care of it in two ways. I didn't mention it. When we selected those 10,000 firms, we did not consider any subsidiaries of other larger firms. So they are all, they are still all independent, all the firms we considered. And yes, we also have the ownership data. I don't have these numbers in front of me, but most of the firms have more than 50% family ownership.
Okay. So they continue to have that ownership. All right. Okay, great. And in terms of how would you then look at the firms which are merely using the word tradition on the website versus the enactment of the tradition itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. Yeah. So as I said, we selected only those that used the word tradition. That was our best approach to filter out. I mean, we already have 30,000 websites. Yeah. So, but there were, of course, a couple of 100,000, and we needed to focus on those that described traditions. Our initial thought was, okay, most companies have something where they describe the company. Yeah, in German would be über uns, or I don't know in English. Where they just say, okay, that's basically our traditional self-perception and so. But we realized that like standardization of websites, especially if you have smaller companies in the engineering business, is not as high as we would expect it. Yeah, because many firms we deal with, they are kind of very professionalized. But out of these 10,000, I think there's a substantial number which are really like, I don't know, maybe 50 people working. Yeah, so nobody really cares about the website. So it's a mess. So you still find this information, but somewhere. And so that's the reason why we said, okay, let's use this one keyword and let the algorithm decide where to search. But of course, there could be other descriptions of narratives or tradition narratives. And I think the other aspect we could filter out quite a bit, those where they use the word tradition, but we're talking about something else. Yeah, so I think, but yeah, there is always some fuzziness, some noise in such kind of data. We have to live with it.
Sure. I think another question. Sorry, I didn't go ahead. I think Kagan has.
No. I did see Kagan's hand up, but
Yeah.
I fixed it. I had two versions of Zoom running on my machine. That was my problem. So Thomas, as you look at tradition as either hindering innovation or holding back innovation, right, which is what you started off with as kind of the contradictory findings. So I was wondering if there's a control variable or some way of measuring if a company is in a crisis situation or not. Because typically, if you're in an incremental innovation kind of a situation, I mean, it's not existential. You could probably very easily see a company, harking on its tradition. We've always adapted to a new environment. We've done these things and so on. Now, in a case of crisis, it could go either way, I suppose, right? I mean, a family firm might say, this is the reason why we abandoned some of our old thinking, because this is a crisis is too important to go wasted, as they say, right? You force a bunch of changes to happen and let go of tradition because it gives you a chance to let go of tradition. You hide behind the fact that you have a crisis. So I was wondering if these are small companies. I understand their websites are probably not super sophisticated, but I wonder, is there any way of figuring out a sense of crisis or not, and whether that might be interesting?
Yeah. Potentially, yes. I mean, we know which companies they are. We have their names. We know the years of when the data were collected. And I must say, this was a project that was, I guess, somehow overlapping with the COVID crisis. And it may even be, we have for some of the companies with survey data, not for the whole, I think for 500 of them, we have survey data. And in this survey, we may even have something about crisis perception. So actually, we did not really look into this. It's really, it could be an interesting, I would say, more an add-on for the future. I'm not sure because for this initial taxonomy, maybe too much, but yes, it's of course interesting. And I think just one spontaneous, like gut feeling response. We did during the COVID crisis, we analyzed innovation behavior of German family firms as response to the crisis. And we were the first who published a management paper on COVID and family businesses. And so we saw that family firms actually, or some of them were quite good in responding to the crisis, coming up with innovation at various levels, even substantial business model innovation. And then we looked in one of these projects into the temporality. So could they keep the business model alive after the crisis was over? And what we found, we didn't look at tradition, but we found that those who aligned the innovation quite well with their core competencies, or you could also say with the logic of the firm, who were more successful in like keeping this business model either as a new one or in parallel to the previous one on a long-term basis, and those who like more radically broke with the tradition it could not benefit from it so much on a long-term basis. Yeah, so maybe that's an interesting perspective. It's one of our initial findings that maybe goes a little bit into this direction.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas.
But just as an addition, maybe the type of crisis may have a bearing on whether they want to align with tradition or not, because with the kind of geopolitical kind of conditions today, it might make more sense for a crisis driven by geopolitics for them to align to tradition, whereas a COVID kind of a thing might make them move out of tradition.
Absolutely. I mean, what happens right now is that many firms say we need to rely on our old values instead of internationalization and I don't know, relying on China. We need to get back to things we valued in the past. So yeah, you're right. It's closely. But a very interesting discussion. But really, I have no evidence. Yeah, that's just more like guessing.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Thomas. Very interesting and very great insights. I was wondering about the source or your approach on getting the information out of websites, as I feel that it might be a discrepancy between how firms really want to show themselves, like the audience on the website, and how they really live tradition within the firm. So what made you choose this approach, and what would you say about like an anonymized interview, getting on information about how they really live tradition? Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. I think there's several answers to this. The pragmatic one is we were curious in also using this kind of data set and exploring it from a different perspective. And I think that's the most important reason why we specified everything here as tradition narratives. So the website is basically the way to communicate the way they would the tradition to be interpreted towards the outside. Yeah, it's a little bit like working with letters to shareholders, which is quite common in the strategy literature. Yeah, of course, it's a design document. It's influenced by communication and public relations professionals, but still there is of course something that they want to be told to the outside inside these documents, and it's the same here. And it's a limitation, of course. We don't know what's in the heads of the people. I think for future research, the combination of this like internal perspective, which would or maybe multiple perspectives. Yeah, I said there's this objective part you could find in the archives. There's the narrative part, communication part, communicated towards the outside that we captured here. And there may be something in between, which is really the interpretation of the employees or the family members if you conduct interviews. And I think if we really want to fully explore tradition, we need to use and combine all sources. Yeah, we're not just there yet, but that opens up multiple avenues for future research.
Thank you so much.
Very, very interesting, Thomas. But yeah, and I think we've kind of really run out of time also. So thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. We will be back again after another couple of months, and we hope to see all of you again there. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas.
Group selfie.
Yeah, we need a group picture. Okay. All right.
Yeah, so before we conclude, yes, I request everyone to switch on the cameras, please, so we can have a quick group selfie. Yes. Thank you so much. So on behalf of the Center for Family Business and Entrepreneurship at SPJIMR, I extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Thomas Claus for your insightful presentation and for sharing your expertise with us today. We thank all the participants for all your enthusiasm and engagement. Wishing you all a wonderful time ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here,
Thank you.
for listening to our research insights, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you.